Hello, you're listening to the Undercurrent Stories podcast with your host, Bob Wells. Welcome back to those listeners who are coming back to us, and a special welcome to any new listeners where it's the first time that you've listened to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed today's show. I remember walking down Oxford Street in London in the early 1970s. There'd been a succession of bombs by the IRA. And for those of us who remember the 70s and the 80s and were brought up in that time, it was the time of the Troubles, the Irish Troubles, which went on for 30 years. And next week, on the 15th of December, marks the another anniversary of the Downing Street Declaration, which took place on the 15th of December 1993. It was a joint UK-Irish agreement offering a peace framework for Northern Ireland. And I wanted to find out a bit more about the cause of the Troubles. Most of us know what happened, the bombings and shootings and Sunday Bloody Sunday, loyalists, orange men. But how many of us actually know how this started? I certainly didn't. And, people talk about William of Orange. So I wanted to go right back to history. So I'm really fortunate to have interviewed a senior lecturer in British and Irish politics and contemporary history at Cardiff University in Wales, Dr. Thomas Leahy. And we had a fantastic discussion. It took about 2 hours, so we're not going to have this conversation for 2 hours. I'm going to split it into 3 episodes, and I really hope that by the end of it, if, like me, you wanted to understand a bit more about the history of the Troubles, that will succeed. It certainly did for me, and I hope you enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Thomas.
Hello, thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to this.
Just before we talk about the history of the Troubles and the Irish history, could you just please tell us about your life's journey and how you became interested in this conflict and peace process in Northern Ireland?
Sure, yeah. So I have my last name would suggest I have an Irish family background, both on my mum and dad's side. I actually grew up in southeast England, and despite living in Wales now, people probably tell by my accent. And yeah, so I have knowledge about the conflict a little bit from family things, less so the Northern Ireland conflict, the Troubles, more so what was called the Irish War of Independence between essentially 1919 up to 1921. But yeah, so essentially from that background, and then I just had an interest from studying at undergraduate level. I mean, this will give away my age, but I remember, which I don't really mind, some late 30s, but I do remember growing up in the 90s, and I do remember at home, and even in this, little primary school I was in Southeast England, that people commented on like the Irish Republican Army, so IRA ceasefires. I remember being quite young, and this was a major turning point, people hoped. And then obviously the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Interestingly, actually, when I speak to colleagues, some people my age, maybe a little bit older, a little bit younger, say for people in Wales who grew up, they remember the same thing at primary school, for example. They remember that being discussed in things like assemblies. So yeah, that's my kind of background to it, really. And yeah, so I think it's, and actually, like family history-wise, I would have had people when we've looked back at things like family tree on both sides. There would have been elements within unionism as well as the British Protestant unionism. So yes, there's been an understanding of that, but also partly, from historical family background to try and understand what was happening in the northern part of Ireland or the northeast part. And yeah, and then I just got into studying it and found it fascinating. So yeah, and then here I am, still doing it.
I'd like to go back to pre-Norman times, say in Viking times, Thomas. What was the situation in Ireland, and in terms of peace and the way it was working, and also any interaction with England? What was it like then? Could we safely say that this is well before any roots of causes to the Troubles?
Yes, you'd be right to say that. And when the Vikings come in, so what's the situation like when they land on the island of Ireland? What are they faced with? Essentially, Ireland was made up, quite similar actually to where I am in Wales, would have been the same in the period. Lots of little chieftains who had their own kind of little fiefdoms. What today we might call like counties, for example. They would have separate rulers. So it wasn't as such it didn't have like one central united ruler or government at that point in time. It would have lots of different little chieftains and rulers. And so when the Vikings came in, and actually, again, I compared not just to Wales, from my throwback to my medieval history days, I was studying in London. And it would have been the same in England, actually, before we had things like King Alfred back in the day. Lots of separate rulers, like, Wessex and Northumbria and things like that, where you had different rulers. Now, that was one of the reasons the Vikings would have been seen as such a kind of cataclysmic threat, basically, because they can come in as a to an extent, united force compared to what they're facing. Where, yeah, if they're able to just take on each little area in their own little chieftain, they obviously get a measure of success over time by doing that. So that's why the Vikings would have been seen as a threat. But yes, there wouldn't have been the influence that you'd have later, certainly from England in Ireland at that point. That doesn't come till later on.
And was there any interaction with England and Wales and Scotland?
Yeah, to some extent there would have been from things such as trade, but obviously at that point, and actually for a fairly long time, really, once you get into the kind of Tudor and then Stuart's period after that where kind of maritime trade and naval escapades, etc., picked up a little bit. At this point in time, although obviously the Vikings, which is fairly unbelievable actually when you think back, kind of buck that trend because they're able to go quite far and wide from where they're traveling in what today would be Scandinavia. That obviously limits it to an extent, but you wouldn't have had the interactions that you have on the scale really from like the 1100s onwards. No, it wouldn't have been on that scale at all.
Okay, and what about religion?
So religion-wise, well, I was going to say fairly simple enough, but actually a little bit complex. The island would have been, for quite a long time, similar as England, similar as Wales, etc., and Scotland, under like pagan faiths, based what today we might term as like pagan faiths, droids, things such as that. Well, that obviously starts to change. Like there's things about said like St. Patrick, for example, and like the rise of Christianity. I mean, in modern day won't be Christian. Well, in its time of the day, it could have even been seen as Christianity, specifically like what later would get termed Catholicism or Roman Catholicism. But there's no Reformation at this point, so like the Protestant Catholic thing doesn't exist. That doesn't come in to essentially the Tudor times for the British and Irish Isles.
And then, of course, we have the Norman conquest in England, and things begin to start heating up a little bit in Ireland when the Normans come across. Could you just give us a bit of background to what happened there, please, Thomas?
Yes, yeah. And so let's look at this in two ways. I think some of it's to understand the Normans per se, are an area near where I grew up, actually, the Battle of Hastings and all this, where William the Conqueror come in. And actually, why even for England, I actually think this is quite important historically looking back, for how the Norman conquest is really seismic for Wales, Scotland, England and Ireland as being nearby neighbours, because of the fact that what you get with the Norman conquest is the fact that, again, when William the Conqueror comes in, so even say, for example, like Northumbria, northern parts of England, to begin with, were against William the Conqueror and would have had a large degree of autonomy. It's not even the situation you'd have today. I mean, I guess one way of thinking of it in modern terminology would be things like we talk about devolution, but it would have been on a mass scale. Basically, parts of northern England were basically its own little kingdom, if you like, as similar to how Scotland would have been in that period. William the Conqueror, I remember this phrase like harrowing of the north, to do with England. That's what happened, that basically they ensured that Northern England came under the kind of fealty or the jurisdiction, if you want to call it that, allegiance of William the Conqueror. So they didn't have, even if there was some devolved level of powers like lords and lordships, but they ultimately, they answered to William the Conqueror. So Normans are quite important in that. And I guess a simple way of me paraphrasing that now that comes into Ireland is attempts to centralise rule under Norman rule. Island-wise, so that's attempted from I think it's 1169, top of my head. So it's definitely in the 1100s. And they go across to start seeing if they can take bits of land and widen the kind of Norman scope of power. And there is some success initially with this in an area that becomes known as the Pale, so basically Dublin, like modern-day Dublin. And that's also where you get this phrase, like beyond the Pale means beyond that. So in this case in Ireland, that beyond what would have been rulers of England's jurisdiction and writ areas that they would kind of control in Ireland. But even then, to an extent, in Dublin, that wasn't like total control in this period. They did rely on local allegiances with chieftains, etc., to ensure that that was possible. Yeah.
So was it very much winning hearts and minds when they went across?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't necessarily think they would have thought of it in that way. The problem was, so despite all the things I just said about Norman centralisation, one of the biggest differences, if someone said to me, what's the difference when you get like Oliver Cromwell in the 1600s compared to what the Normans are doing? The difference of Oliver Cromwell in that later period is what was termed at that time in English Civil War the New Model Army, which later just basically becomes the precursor to the British Army. That's really different to what the Normans had. And really monarchs right up to that period in the late 1500s, 1600s. The way they would have fought wars and battles was they wouldn't have like a standing army as such. Where in this case, and really until French Revolution, so fast forward, you start getting the idea of like conscripted armies. But Oliver Cromwell would have been different because you still had a form of standing army, new model army. So these are basically like professional soldiers. This is their career. We have a version of that today for getting making that easier for people to understand what we have in the British Army, for example, in the modern day parlance. There's not national conscription now, but the people who are in the army are professional soldiers. That's their career.
Yeah.
When you go back to like the Norman period and really the Tudors and backwards from that, you don't have that. You know, there'd be one or two like knights or famous courtiers around monarchs in England, same in Scotland actually in that period, who, you know, would have their background in like personal protection, if you like, for monarchs rather than necessarily leading a kind of swarm of large amounts of soldiers and fighters. So what would happen when you went to conflict? You'd often like hire mercenaries in a kind of modern parlance. So a lot of these, some of them might not actually be from England, Wales, Ireland, etc. They might actually be from abroad, like German lands, French lands, etc. And so why does that matter? Because when you're trying to conquest areas, once you've gone in and if you've won some initial battles, but if there's kind of then like uprisings or insurgencies against that, you don't necessarily have like a standing army to put that down, or kind of I guess another way of putting that's like a standing police force. So yes, you do have to then rely a little bit if you're stuck and you're facing opposition. What are you going to do? Because for a monarch as well, if you keep hiring the mercenaries and keep them, it drains your money. And even in the days before Parliament had any real power with Westminster in London, Parliament had a power over like monarchs' budgets. That was one or two powers it actually did have. And as we know from like English history in particular, over time that led to some disputes and actually partly what the Civil War was about in the 1600s between the British monarch or English monarch and then the Parliament. So that made the situation difficult. So basically, and also we've got to put it in the picture, like the wider worldview of like the Normans. They weren't just interested in Ireland. They were interested in obviously maintaining power in England, increasing their power in Wales, which they successfully did by the late 1200s, basically put Wales under English rule. Later on, Scotland, that was going on all the time. William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, that's going on, you know, once you get into the kind of 1300s as well. And then obviously the interest for Normans, as the name suggests, in like Normandy, they still had interest in owning some lands in what's modern day France. So they were trying to look after that as well. So in a sense, they go into Ireland. It's quite difficult to expand that phrase beyond the Pale. It costs a lot of money, so they just don't do it. So you are right to say that what they start to do, certainly in the Pale area, like modern day Dublin, basically, they would like intermarry any Normans who've come across. They might have local allegiances. They might have local treaties and agreements with local Irish chieftains. And then that can spread outside the area. Certainly beyond the Pale, they had to do that if they wanted any kind of trade or influence elsewhere. But that's really quite different because that means beyond the Pale in particular, those people, the chieftains in charge, they do not come under English rules, English laws, and jurisdiction at that point. They do their own thing.
And what about religion? What part did religion play in all this?
At this point, so this is interesting, actually, I guess, if we then compare it to the later periods once you get the Reformation. So without making it massively complex, because it can be quite complex, Reformation, but basically it's a split in the Christian church, and in this case, the Catholic Church, where Protestantism forms for various reasons, which we might get into in a minute. But anyway, pre that happening really in the 1500s, a little bit early in the rest of Europe, late 1400s, But in the British and Irish Isles, 1500s and then into the 1600s. Before that, the Normans themselves would have been Catholic as such. So therefore, there's no religious dispute. The conflict essentially is not at that point. I would contest that there's religious aspects, and certainly in the 1600s, I wouldn't deny that. There's definitely religious overtones to what's happening. But in this period, it's really about, what nationality, although that isn't such a big concept at that time, but which people from which lands and which monarchs are ruling where. That's essentially what it's about. And at this point, so there wouldn't have been a disagreement over things like Roman Catholic Church and beliefs in popes and things like that. That wouldn't have been the disagreement. The disagreement where there would have been differences aside from religion is things like law. So Ireland followed something called Brehon law, and Brehon law was quite different. Just one example, one of the reasons why it was quite different to what happened in Norman times and the evolution of kind of English rule and law. So, for example, under Brehon law, it wasn't this idea that, like, say if an Irish chieftain had children, it wasn't always guaranteed that, like, all your land would go to the eldest. That's quite different from what evolves from things like English common law, basically, which comes down from, like, the monarchs downwards. And you can see from that, actually, when England does expand its writ in Ireland, they would look at things like that and think that's chaos in their view. Which chieftains wouldn't have seen it in that way because that was the kind of customary way things were done. So that's quite different. And actually on things like gender as well, like interestingly, girls could be part of that in families under Brehon law. They could inherit land, for example. So they're quite distinct things. You can see already from there. So religion isn't a difference in this period. But in terms of things like customs and rules and laws about things like inheritance, that was quite different. So it can partly explain where they were. They tried to make changes. But the problem was, going back to your question then about conquest, basically, it was difficult to do because you didn't have a standing army and you had to put huge resources and time into that, which they didn't want to do.
So in summary, up until the Norman period, Ireland very much did its own thing in terms of its chieftains. The Normans came in. There wasn't an issue with religion because it was Catholic, but it was very much an attempt to gain control. So I guess between the 1200s and the 1500s, it was mixed rule. And then, of course, we come up to the early modern period, Tudor period, and then things change again, don't they?
Significantly, yeah. So, again, caveat, if we look at, say, like Henry VII, so Henry VIII's dad, not initially. Under Henry VII, when the Tudors come in, so War of the Roses, etc., at that point, he may well have had some significant interest in Ireland, but comes back to that point, you don't have things like a standing army, and that actually continues to be an issue for the Tudors right through, although Elizabeth I gets more of a foothold in Ireland. But also for Henry Tudor coming on the throne, War of the Roses, the old adage, live by the sword, technically die by the sword. If you overthrow someone or a certain rulers or whatever governments by force, then you're at risk of that. So Henry VII in particular, when he would come to the throne, that was a major risk. Like there were uprisings in parts of England, not necessarily massively significant, but there was a threat. So his eyes would have been on that primarily, and getting the Tudor rule, embedded into like England and Wales overall. And also the thing under Henry VII, there's no Reformation at that point. He's a member of the Catholic Church and follows Rome. That hasn't changed. It starts to change, as everyone would well know, under Henry VIII, and it changes essentially quite different, I think, from the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe was parts of my reading anyway. People have different views on this, but my reading of like Protestant Reformation in German lands, for example, was more of a bottom-up thing. It comes from the bottom up, and it's elements of what would have been Catholic clergy who essentially felt the Church of Rome is corrupt and it's led by corruption, and we don't like it. It should go back to like what the Bible's preaching, etc. So that's really where you get it in Europe. I think it's quite different. Not for everyone. I think some of the courtiers around, say, Henry VIII, some of the more kind of middling clergy, so I'm talking not necessarily class at that point, because class didn't exist in the same way, but middling sort, we'll call them in society, would have felt that, yeah, there's corruption at the top of the Catholic Church, similar to their European counterparts. But the biggest difference, so why does it get acted upon, the Reformation in England in particular, and then into Wales, which is under Act of Union at that point in the 1500s, because Henry VIII ensures that's the case. Why does he do that? Because he wants to divorce one of his wives. So that would be my view. I don't think there's anything particularly significant. And some actually authors on this period have, talked about things like is Henry VIII just basically Catholicism about the Pope? I would say that's accurate. Yeah, I think that's because actually people then who were seen as going too far, even people like one of his loyal courtiers at point, people would know from watching things like Wolf Hall, Sir Thomas Cromwell. Eventually, he has him like executed because he says his ideas are too radical and they're plotting against the Reformation for Henry, etc. Anyway, so how does that link to Ireland? Henry does then try to send some troops into Ireland at some of these points to again expand the writ, but he's obviously pretty busy at home trying to enforce the Reformations, requisition of monasteries and things such as that. So he's basically got enough on his plate and he's not going to invest loads of money in it. So they just stay in the Dublin Pale. That doesn't change. Kind of the same then for his successors after that. So he's very basically young infant son, Edward, who doesn't live very long either. And there's a big period of instability there because obviously Edward has, I think they were called protectors in his place. I can't remember the exact term. Northumberland was one of them, I remember, and he ends up, one of them gets executed. It might be him. But that was about, again, that it was a kind of inter-England-Wales dispute about how radical the Reformation should be. But Edward never takes the throne because he dies at a young age. Mary comes in. Now, Mary switches it back to Catholic faith, Mary Tudor. So at that point, obviously, there's no real ruptures of Ireland because there's not a dispute about faith. She doesn't seem to make much attempt either to expand their control there. Probably, again, because the emphasis is keeping England, or getting England back under the Catholic Church and faith, and that's going to take a lot of undoing of things that happened under her predecessors. When she then dies, Elizabeth, right? So when Elizabeth comes in, initially there's not any real attempt to expand things in Ireland as such. But once we get to the latter period of the 1500s, once you get 1580s, 90s, there is a kind of more assertive and aggressive attempt in parts of the island of Ireland, which are already under, mainly the Pale area, under English rule, to make them start conforming to Protestantism and Protestant customs. And also attempting to, any Irish chieftain or ruler who remains, is that basically they're given, in a sense, like two options. Either you face battle, or you face that you have to declare allegiance to Elizabeth I to be your monarch. And obviously the issue with that changes things like the Brehon law would go out the window because you have to change to English common law and customs to follow that. So unsurprisingly, mainly from what today would be north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, there's an uprising by the Earl of Tyrone. And it starts to spread in various parts of the country. To stop it, in the 1590s, Elizabeth does have to send quite a lot of troops in to do that. They managed to do so. What's agreed at the end is a peace treaty, basically. And one of the things I just talked about there's an agreement to basically, there's a word for this. It's like basically redistribute the titles of land that some of the chieftains held, like the Earl of Tyrone, but they have to declare allegiance and fealty, to homage, if you like, to Elizabeth.
Yeah.
So they do. And then this would be at the end of her period of life, going into then James VI of Scotland, James I of England, because he takes the throne then in England. For some reason, there's the flight of the Earls, and they decide to run off, basically. A lot of them went actually to Spain. There's a bit of debate, historians, why this would be. Like, my reading of it is, again, that kind of low-level pressure on from like English influence in there drives them out to an extent. And even we could go as far as say intimidates people out. But it certainly puts pressure on them to remember, like, we call the shots here, not you anymore.
Sorry to interrupt. I've got two questions which I'd like to ask, which are sort of before the flight of the Earls. It might sound a basic question, but what was the motivation for Elizabeth I increasing the impact of rule, wanting to rule Ireland? Was it something to do with the fact that they were worried about influence from, the threat from Spain? Or did that have anything to do with it? And the second question I've got connected with that is the original Normans that came over that obviously had I wouldn't say they'd gone native, but they'd been absorbed into the culture. How did they react when all this was happening?
Yes, they're both very good questions. So the first question, why did Elizabeth want to expand the writ in Ireland? You're absolutely right. I think it's an element of paranoia basically. And I think let's give a modern day example. Why was the US so concerned about Cuba having missiles? Because it's feared that that was an attempt by the Soviet Union is using it as a launch pad to start pressurizing the US and actually maybe invading the US and trying to spread Soviet communism there. In in these days we're talking about here in the Tudor times, again, like the really big thing for Elizabeth, that chronology we talked about, her father comes in, starts to kind of moderately switch it towards Protestantism. Edward, the son of then Tudor Edward VI, then attempts to, well, he doesn't, but the rulers in his place attempt to radicalize that and speed that up. Mary comes in and reverses the whole lot. So when Elizabeth comes in and then decides to conform to the kind of Protestant faith, there's a paranoia that, there's Catholics and sometimes higher up in societies would have seen with Mary the First and her courtiers, etc., who could reverse this. And therefore, there's an element of, as I said, some of it would have been real, like people who were opposed to Reformation, but an element would have been paranoia as well, that, kind of the thing you would see in the US, like Reds under the bed type scare. Same kind of thing, but just back in this day with the Reformation. So why, and here's an interesting fact, since I'm in Wales, it's really interesting actually, by I want to say 1570s, I remember studying this. I mean, Elizabeth was concerned about Wales, for example, because they felt by that point, so she'd been ruling them for at least a decade plus. And actually the reports coming on to her saying, we're concerned about Wales and we're actually concerned that there might be an uprising here. But again, some of the reasons that we're trying to change it away from the Catholic faith, we're not sure that people like that in Wales, including some of the earls, etc., and there could be an uprising. What changed it in Wales fundamentally was the fact that when the Bible was converted into different languages, so to explain that for listeners, in the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, right up to modern times, going into the 1960s, 1970s, everything was done via Latin. So for people, and you remember back in the day, this is before people, what today might be like middle class, lower working class, so lower class in society would have gone to things like school. You would turn up to a mass and you couldn't understand it because most people wouldn't have spoke Latin other than the kind of higher echelons of society.
Yeah.
So in Wales, the big change there was converting the Bible into Welsh. The language of Welsh. And then that seems to change things. And by the 1590s, they don't have those concerns anymore about Wales. And I think that putting the Bible into Welsh, so, okay, people couldn't necessarily read again for middle class or what today would be middle class or working class back then because they wouldn't have all gone to school. But the difference is they could understand it in the dialect of like everyday language.
Yes.
In Ireland, because there wasn't the desire to switch from the Church of Rome, from the peoples who lived there, and certainly priests, clergy, higher echelons of society, these chieftains, that would have been seen as by Elizabeth a kind of act of rebellion in itself. Passive rebellion, but it's an act of rebellion. You've been asked to conform, you're not conforming. And yes, and then the big fear, going back to that Soviet Union Cuba example, modern day parlance, is that basically the Church of Rome, France, Spain, Catholic kind of major powers in Europe might use Ireland as a launch pad, as a counter-reformation to invade England, Scotland, or Wales. Basically, that was the major concern.
Yeah.
So that's question one. Question two, which was about Normans. Yes. So this complicates it for everyone here. But you start getting different terminology of peoples who lived at this point in Ireland. So you have what people call like native Irish or old Irish. Okay, so people who lived in Ireland for a long time, they speak Gaelic. They followed Irish chieftains. They'd follow those different laws like Brehon law, etc. Then you get what's called Old English. So Old English, obviously they may well follow, certainly in time when the Normans were in charge and right up to Henry VII, they would have followed certain English customs, certain English laws, etc. But the difference between them and what became known, particularly once we get into the 1600s under the Stuart rulers, New English were Protestant. So they're a different religion to Old English. Old English, they've descended from people who would have invaded since the Norman times, particularly in like the Dublin areas, as we said, the Pell. But they ultimately are Catholic. That's their religion. Once you start from Elizabeth I and then James I, etc., coming in charge, and they start saying, well, people are going to hold land and they're going to be the rulers of these areas based on their religion, not necessarily whether they're loyal to the monarchs or not. It's religion and the loyalty to the monarch is the key thing. The Old English then start, and certainly again when we talk about the 1600s in a second, they start to see this as a threat, and they're moving closer to the Irish native people who lived there because of the fact that they're facing a common threat, basically religious, in modern day parlance, religious discrimination.
And I guess it's fair to say that, when James I or James VI of Scott came into power as James I, he then accelerated all this with putting plantations in Ulster.
Yes, exactly. And again, so if we look at, okay, why is that happening? So what's happening first? Why is it happening? What's happening is James I then decided again to really cement Protestantism, because even for James I, looking back at that point, trying to understand that mindset, same as Elizabeth. I mean, it's only 50 plus years since Mary had been on the throne, or 40 plus years even. And, there would have still been concerns about, Catholic plotters who are going to remove James and courtiers, etc., who followed Protestant faith. So that would have been in every single bit of territory they're holding at that point. And once you get the flight of the Earls in certainly the northeast of Ireland, but various parts of Ireland as well, where these Earls have left and chieftains, not all of them had left, but a sizable number of them. And one in particular would have been key as the Earl of Tyrone, because he led the rebellion, what was called like the O'Neill Rebellion against Elizabeth I. When they've left, so there's this land that basically now is empty of a chieftain. And so straight away, in that sense, that James and his advisors come in and say, right, we need to put our people in there. So, but it also comes an interesting thing about what's going on in Scotland, England and Wales. And at that point, if you had disgruntled lords who obviously were loyal to the Protestant faith, and you wanted to give them land, so this land becomes available in Ireland. So this was another way to keep people happy, partly, but less so that. The main way is to cement and spread Protestant influence, and ultimately the two things together, English/British/Protestant, those three things together, control into Ireland. So it's not going to be a launch pad for any rebellions. And then, so you get what's called a plantation of Ireland, but also the plantation of Ulster. So it does happen across Ireland. Particularly then what you're getting in Ulster. And when we say Ulster, so Ulster, it means different things to different people. Technically, historically, it means the 9 ancient counties of the Ulster province in Ireland. So there were 9 of them. The 6 that make up today's Northern Ireland, plus Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, which are in the Republic today. But they move a number of these Protestant settlers in there, often from Scotland, actually, partly ease of access coming in from Scotland, but also to, because there's this land available just across the sea, so it's easy to get to people from there. And what's key with that is that they're moved in. They obviously have a different faith. They definitely do not follow Gaelic chieftain practices and customs. So Brehon law in particular, they do not follow that at all. So you can see that tensions start to mount. And the tensions start to mount for 2 people. Obviously, for the native Irish or the old Irish, obviously it's going to mount for them because it's against their Brehon law customs, it's against their religion, etc. But now, as we just talked about previously, now for the Old English, these are basically Norman time settlers onwards, but they were still under Catholic faith and customs. They're under threat because also they're losing like rights and privileges. And basically, in a modern kind of day way of thinking about this, the reason it starts to stir up huge amounts of tensions is because you have a 2-tier society. You have at the top is people who are coming in as British Protestant settlers, and they're the ones who can, call in the shots with laws and customs. Suddenly they're the ones who are owning land. And then you've got the people at the bottom of the ladder, essentially, and that you can see the other 2 groups starting to unite together, and you get that from the 1641's rebellion period onwards. Old Irish and Old English, who, because of their Catholic commonality between them, start being seen as like othered. They're not part of expectations of what the British monarchs want to see in people ruling certain lands and areas. And you'd also have things such as some skirmishes, some battles between chieftains, so land could partly be taken from that. And yes, there's a lot of tension.
So that closes our first episode of the mini-series about the Irish Troubles. Hope you found it interesting and found Dr. Leahy's explanation of the history behind the Troubles really helped with your understanding. It certainly did with me. He conveys it in such an easy to understand manner. In our next episode, we continue this historical journey from the 17th century onwards. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast platform for all updates. So until next time, bye for now.